Very interesting report we just had there from the Klima Forum. Now we're back here on OneClimate.net in the UN Conference Center, where all the action is taking place in the hallways behind us. And now we've got Bill McKibben, the founder of 350.org, with us to talk a little bit more about the pressure that a lot of groups have been putting on leaders and seeing what he thinks about what's coming up in the next couple of days. So Bill, thanks a lot for being with us. First I want, if you could, please just explain to us why 350 is the magic number.
2 years ago, all of a sudden, sea ice melted across the Arctic. And all of a sudden, scientists said, look, this thing is happening faster than we thought. We got to go back and recalibrate. By January of 2008, the world's foremost climatologists, first Jim Hansen, the NASA scientist, published a series of papers saying 350 is the bottom line. Any value for carbon in the atmosphere greater than 350 parts per million is not compatible with the planet on which civilization developed or to which life on Earth is adapted. Strong language. Strong language, especially when you know that we're above it at 390 parts per million already, which is why the Arctic is melting, okay? So, the clear implication is we need a much tougher political response than we've been contemplating. This is not some problem for your grandchildren. This is a problem right now that if we do not get a hold of right now, we will never get a hold of. Hence this big global campaign that we've been mounting.
So we're now around 390 parts per million. Basically what this means is that there's a certain amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and it's calculated based on this number that scientists use, and we don't need to go into the details of how they calculate that, but we should be at 350 and we're at 390.
That's right. It's just like going to the doctor, and the doctor says, your cholesterol is, 280, and above 200, you're going to have a heart attack. So do something about it. If we were medical patients, we would do something about it. In this case, the United States and the other great powers are saying, pay no attention to the doctor. We can go to cholesterol, run it up to, 400. We'll eat, 3% less steak in 2020. And something like that, that's what we're proposing. We're not proposing to deal with this as serious adults would.
But if we're already at 390 and 350 is the healthy limit, isn't it too late?
Happily. Forests and oceans sequester carbon. They take it out of the atmosphere. If we stop putting more in, it would take a few decades, but that carbon would be collected out of the atmosphere and we'd get back toward a habitable level. Not without damage being done. There's going to be damage done. There already is. We're not going to prevent global warming. What we're playing for now is stopping short of complete civilizational scale challenge. And it's not at all clear that we can still do that, but there's some evidence that we can, so we better try.
I'll remind everybody, this is OneClimate.net. You can post your questions or comments for Bill McKibben at OneClimate.net, and we'll put as many of those through as we can. Or if you're watching somewhere else, you can always use the Twitter hashtag OneClimate, and we'll pick those up as well. Bill, you've recently wrote a book. It's called Earth, but you spell Earth with 2 A's. Can you tell us why?
Sure. It is an odd title, E-A-A-R-T-H, and in fact, it won't even be out until April. But the reason for the odd title is we really have changed this planet. When I wrote The End of Nature 20 years ago, the first book about climate change, it was still something that was coming down the pike. But now we can see it. The poles are losing their ice at an astonishing rate. High-altitude glaciers are disappearing. Hydrological cycles have changed dramatically. We're seeing way more drought and way more flood. Very fundamental things about the Earth have already changed. Now, we need to take dramatic action to keep them from changing even more, but we also need to make sure that we start dealing with those changes as they come at us.
You say...
And so I guess the reason we call it Earth is that it's a planet pretty much like the one we're used to. It's still mostly water, gravity still pertains, but it doesn't operate in most of the ways that the old EARTH Earth worked. We're kind of on a new planet.
It sounds like you're indicating that now that we're on this new planet, we have to understand how a civilization lives on this new planet, how a civilization should be ordered, and you can't necessarily do all the things that we used to do on our old planet, so some real fundamental change is needed.
That's right. We are going to need some new habits. And ironically, they tend to take us in two different directions. We need to live our lives much more locally. We no longer are going to have the increment of cheap fossil fuel to allow us to just send food halfway around the world and send ourselves halfway around the world all the time and things. We need much more localized economies, sources of food and energy. We also need, though, a much more globalized mindset for at least a few of these problems. We have to figure out how to also tackle climate change on a global level, or else it gets so out of control that there's no place on Earth that'll be habitable no matter what we do.
I want to remind everybody you can put your questions or comments to Bill at OneClimate.net or using the hashtag on Twitter, OneClimate. I'm with my colleague Adam Groves. Adam, what have you got for Bill?
Yeah, addressing this as at a global level, there's a question come in saying how do we convince people at a global level to take action? A feeling that it hasn't really happened yet. There's a lot of talk about 350 being a global day. There was huge marches in Ethiopia, across the northern world. Was it a global movement? Is it a global movement?
Yeah, it's the first global movement about this, and in some ways one of the first global movements about anything. CNN called our Day of Action in October the most widespread day of political action in the planet's history on any issue. There were 5,200 demonstrations in 181 countries. We showed definitively that environmentalism is not rich white people, it's everybody. And we've built the kind of movement that's actually had some serious effect here. It's really bolstered the morale of small and vulnerable nations and allowed them to be much more aggressive than they would otherwise have been. I did a press conference with the head of the small island states on Friday when they introduced a very strong draft text. And I said, look, you guys are much closer, you guys understand the science much better than the Americans or anybody else. You're not taken seriously because you don't have armies. We'll be your army as best we can. And last weekend we organized 3,000 vigils around the world to drive that message home. On Sunday, thousands of churches in every part of the world, including the great cathedral here in Copenhagen, rang their bells 350 times. The message is getting out. The movement is building. The U.S. remains, and a few other powers, very, very difficult.
What type of movement do you feel this needs to be? You mentioned the Sunday, the church bells ringing on Saturday. We had huge protests outside the Bella Centre, and tomorrow there's a Reclaim the Power action. People saying they're going to enter the Bella Centre and use the space for civil society. Is direct action kind of increasingly popular, and what's kind of your take on this?
I think any kind of nonviolent action of any kind is what we need. I helped run the first big civil disobedience in the United States on climate last spring when we brought 5,000 people to Washington, D.C. and shut down the coal-fired power plant that used to power Congress. We'll do more of that kind of thing. This very much depends where you are in the world that you're working. We ran 300 demonstrations across China. Well, nobody organizes in China for this kind of thing. And we're clearly not going to go tell people in China to do civil disobedience because the consequences will be more severe than they would be in Vermont, So it takes many different kinds of tactics, but what it really takes is a unified message. And that's been the real strength of 350. We've taken a number and had everybody say the same thing at the same time, so it's been loud enough to break through the clutter. That's why it emerged as the most important of these things.
But at the same time as everyone was rallying over the weekend and, massive global movement, not only here in Copenhagen, but all over the world, at that exact same time, the 350 parts per million bit was being taken out of the negotiating text here.
That's what I say. I mean, what we're seeing now in this negotiation and what we'll see for the next few through the end is the exercise not of reason, but of power. The U.S. and others will attempt to intimidate everybody else into doing what they want to do, and there's a pretty good chance that they'll succeed. There are about 100 nations trying to put 350 back in the text, They're the poor nations, so they're not going to rule the outcome. But at least this process is well underway. At least there's a fight where there wouldn't have been a year ago.